It started on a warm Thursday afternoon, the kind of day you look forward to when you live in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. The sun was high, the breeze just strong enough to rustle the wind chimes on my porch, and I was elbow deep in trimming hedges by the gate when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. At first, I thought it was a delivery, or maybe my neighbor Joe bringing over eggs like he sometimes did. But when I stood and wiped my hands, I was met with the unmistakable sight of Brenda Hallbrook, the HOA president, standing at the gate in a pastel blouse, clipboard in hand, and a sour expression that looked like it had been marinating for days. Brenda didn't wait for a greeting. She marched up to the fence, peered through the bars like a prison warden, and said, "I need to inspect your backyard." "Open the gate." "No, hello. No reason, just a demand." Now, for context, Brenda and I had history. She'd been up in arms about my slightly taller than regulation fence for months, and she absolutely loathed that I didn't attend the monthly HOA meetings where she liked to read the rules word for word, like she was performing Shakespeare. The truth was, I liked my privacy. I kept my lawn tidy, paid my dues, and minded my own business. That should have been enough, but not for Brenda. I leaned against the fence and said, "You don't have any right to enter my property without a warrant or a valid reason. So, no." Her jaw twitched. "I'm the HOA president." "And I'm a homeowner," I replied, keeping my tone even. "What's the issue today?" She clicked her pen dramatically and held up the clipboard. "There's been a complaint about unapproved landscaping and possible unauthorized structures in your backyard." I knew exactly what she was talking about, my newly built shed. I had filed the paperwork and gotten verbal approval from the architectural committee. Brenda just hadn't gotten the memo, or more likely, she ignored it because it wasn't routed through her. "I already got that cleared with Bill from the committee," I told her. "The paperwork was signed and filed 2 weeks ago. If you have a problem, take it up with him." Brenda's eyes narrowed like she was trying to laser a hole through my forehead. "I'll be reporting this to the board." "You do that," I said, "but you're not coming onto my property." She stood there for a few seconds longer, her face a cocktail of disbelief and barely restrained fury. Then, like it was her trump card, she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she said, tapping furiously. I raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." It was ridiculous, calling the police because I wouldn't let her snoop around my backyard, but I knew my rights, and I had nothing to hide. Brenda's power trip had gone too far, and if she wanted to involve law enforcement, I was more than ready. So I went inside, poured myself some iced tea, and waited. I didn't lock the gate. I didn't hide anything. I simply let the wheels turn. 20 minutes later, a patrol car rolled up, lights off, engine humming quietly. Out stepped Officer Delgado, someone I'd seen around a few times before. Young guy, but sharp, and he always had a smirk like he was one bad joke away from losing his composure. Brenda marched toward him like he was her personal enforcer. She started explaining loudly, with sweeping hand gestures, pointing toward my house like I'd been cooking meth in the backyard instead of storing garden tools. Delgado looked at her, then at me standing on the porch. He walked over casually, giving me a little nod. "Afternoon," he said. "We got a call about a trespassing refusal." I nodded. "That's right. She tried to demand access to my backyard. I refused. Told her she had no legal authority without a warrant or court order." Brenda butted in. "He's violating HOA guidelines. I have every right to inspect." Delgado held up a hand. "Ma'am, this is a civil matter. You're not law enforcement, and unless there's a legal order, you can't enter someone's private property without permission." Brenda looked like she was going to explode. "But I'm the HOA president." Delgado let out a short laugh. Not mocking, but almost stunned. He turned back to me and grinned. "You're good here." Then he tipped his hat, turned back to Brenda, and said, "Next time, don't waste a patrol unit's time on HOA business." As he got back in the car and drove off, I stood there on the porch, watching Brenda's face go from red to white to red again. She didn't say another word, just spun on her heel and stomped back to her car like a toddler who'd been told no. And that's when I knew. The battle with the HOA wasn't over, but I had just won the first round. Refusing Brenda entry to my property wasn't just about asserting dominance. It wasn't about showing off or getting the last word. It was about principle and knowing exactly where my rights as a homeowner started and where hers as an HOA president ended. The truth is, I didn't move to this neighborhood to be micromanaged. I bought the property because I wanted space, quiet, and a bit of privacy. Something hard to find these days with cookie-cutter subdivisions and neighbors who monitor your trash cans like it's a military drill. When I bought the house, I read the HOA agreement thoroughly. I didn't sign it blindly. Like most HOAs, it had its fair share of petty rules: trash days, approved paint colors, mailbox heights. Most of it was tolerable. I followed the rules, kept my yard neat, and didn't throw wild parties. I respected the community. But somewhere along the line, Brenda decided that her role as HOA president made her the queen of the block. She started showing up unannounced, clipboard always in hand, snapping photos of people's yards from the sidewalk, making courtesy calls about lawn length and holiday decorations. At first, most people just humored her. Easier to smile and nod than deal with her wrath. But I'm not most people. It started small. She left a note on my door about the color of my new garden shed. I'd chosen a subtle olive green, one that matched my house trim. Apparently, it wasn't in harmony with the surrounding environment. I ignored the note at first. A week later, she returned and knocked. "You didn't respond to the notice," she said, voice tight. "I didn't realize I was required to," I replied. "It's a garden shed, not a second-story addition." Brenda pursed her lips and left without another word. A few days later, a formal notice appeared, this one threatening fines. I spoke to Bill from the architectural committee, who had no problem with the shed. He approved it informally right then and there, and I submitted a retroactive request just to dot the I's. That should have been the end of it. But Brenda doesn't like being bypassed. That's why, when she showed up demanding to inspect my backyard, I didn't even hesitate. She was trying to make an example out of me, to show the rest of the neighborhood what happened when you didn't fall in line. But here's the thing. She had no authority. According to the HOA agreement, inspections had to be requested in writing and scheduled with homeowner consent. Emergencies were an exception, but a shed and some rose bushes hardly qualify as a national crisis. By refusing her entry, I was doing more than just saying no. I was making it clear that her power had limits, and those limits stopped at my fence. After the cop left and she stormed off, I expected her to retaliate. Maybe another fine notice. Maybe another bogus complaint filed with the board. But in those first few hours, the silence was almost louder than any accusation. Later that evening, I sat on my porch with a cold drink, watching the sun dip behind the neighbor's tall oak tree. A couple folks walking their dogs gave me a thumbs up or a chuckle as they passed. One neighbor even said, "About time someone stood up to her." That's when it hit me. Brenda had ruled with fear, disguised as order, for too long. People weren't mad that I refused her. They were relieved. Someone had finally drawn the line. Of course, I knew this wasn't the end. With someone like Brenda, you don't just win and walk away. She'd be back. Maybe more careful, maybe more dramatic. But I was ready. I didn't pick a fight, I just stopped backing down. And from that day on, I kept everything documented. Every conversation, every letter, every photo. I installed a camera by the gate. Not because I was paranoid, but because I knew that when power gets challenged, it doesn't go quietly. This wasn't just about a shed anymore. It was about control and the illusion that one person could dictate how others live, even if it meant crossing the line into their yards, their lives, and their peace of mind. I refused to live under that illusion. I liked my privacy, my independence, and the freedom to build a tool shed without it triggering a suburban inquisition. So I stood my ground, not with shouting or pettiness, but with facts, patience, and a steel spine. Because sometimes the best way to deal with a power-hungry HOA president isn't to fight fire with fire. It's to let the fire burn itself out while you calmly water your roses and enjoy your freedom. If there's one thing you don't expect to hear over a garden fence on a lazy Thursday, it's someone threatening to call the police over a backyard shed. But that's exactly what Brenda did. And it wasn't just a bluff. After I denied her entry and calmly explained that she had no legal grounds to inspect my backyard, Brenda stood stiffly, phone already in her hand like a sword she'd been waiting to draw. She made a big show of dialing. Volume on, speaker enabled. "Yes, hello. I'm the president of the Ridgewood Hills Homeowners Association," she said with exaggerated importance. "One of our residents is refusing to comply with HOA inspection rules and is being combative." I raised an eyebrow but kept quiet. Combative? I hadn't raised my voice once. The dispatcher clearly asked if there was any emergency or violence. Brenda hesitated just a little too long. "No physical violence yet, but he's being extremely hostile." I could tell even over the speaker that the dispatcher wasn't buying it, but protocol required them to send someone out. I wasn't worried. I had nothing to hide and everything, from my paperwork to my property rights, was in order. After she hung up, Brenda crossed her arms, glaring at me through the gate like she had already won. "You'll see. The officer will make you cooperate." "No, Brenda," I said calmly. "The officer will explain that you have no authority to enter my property without consent, and you'll look ridiculous." That wiped the smug look off her face. She huffed and muttered something under her breath, then returned to her SUV parked a few feet down the road. From her window, I could see her writing furiously in her clipboard, probably adding today's refusal to some running log of perceived neighborhood offenses. 20 minutes later, a patrol car rolled around the corner. The cruiser's slow roll and dark windows gave it a certain gravity, and a few neighbors peeked through blinds or stepped out onto porches. You could practically feel the tension thicken in the air. Officer Delgado stepped out, mid-30s, clean-cut, and already scanning the scene like he knew exactly the type of call this was going to be. He'd probably handled his fair share of HOA dramas before. Brenda practically leapt out of her vehicle and intercepted him before he could take 5 steps. "Officer, thank you for coming," she said, arms folded tightly. "He refused to let me inspect his property, which is a direct violation of our community rules." Delgado raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, just to clarify, you're saying this is an HOA matter, not a criminal one?" Brenda nodded stiffly. "It's a serious violation." He looked unimpressed. "And has he threatened you? Trespassed? Broken any laws?" "No, but he's refusing to comply with the HOA," she said, voice rising in frustration. Delgado turned toward me, still standing calmly on my porch. "Sir, mind if I ask you a few questions?" "Not at all," I said, walking up to the fence. "She showed up unannounced demanding to inspect my backyard. I refused. There's no emergency, no legal order, and I haven't violated any laws. I've got paperwork for the shed she's referring to, approved by the architectural committee." He gave me a slow nod. "Sounds pretty straightforward." Then something I didn't expect. Delgado chuckled. It wasn't loud or mocking. It was the kind of laugh someone lets out when they realize they've been dragged into something utterly ridiculous. "Ma'am," he turned back to Brenda, "HOA rules are civil, not criminal. We're here for emergencies, not enforcement of neighborhood politics." Brenda's mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. Then, "He's being deliberately obstructive." Delgado shrugged. "He's within his rights. We can't force him to let you onto his property. That's not how any of this works." Brenda's face turned a deeper shade of red with each word. She crossed her arms tightly, glaring at both of us now. "This isn't over." Delgado tipped his head to me, clearly amused. "Looks like you've got this under control. Let us know if you need anything." With that, he returned to his cruiser. As he pulled away, he shook his head and, I kid you not, laughed again. The moment the patrol car turned the corner, Brenda turned and stomped to her car, tires squealing as she pulled off down the road. The tension broke like a popped balloon. From across the street, old Mr. Levinson, who hadn't left his porch all day, gave me a thumbs up. That was the best entertainment I've had in weeks. And while I laughed too, deep down I knew this wasn't over. Brenda wasn't the type to let something like this go. She'd been embarrassed publicly, and people were starting to see the cracks in her control, which meant she'd either come back harder or sneakier. Either way, I wasn't going to back down. Not now, I'll be honest. When Officer Delgado pulled up, I expected a mess. Not because I had anything to hide, but because in situations like these, it only takes one person on a power trip and a cop who's too by the book to turn a civil disagreement into something it was never meant to be. But to my surprise, Delgado didn't play into it. In fact, he turned out to be exactly the kind of person you want, showing up when someone's trying to flex authority they don't legally have. As soon as he stepped out of his cruiser, Brenda was on him like a lawyer chasing a camera. She strutted over, waving her clipboard, launching into a speech like she'd rehearsed it in her bathroom mirror. "She's really putting on a show," I murmured to myself, watching from my porch with an iced tea in hand. Delgado's face remained neutral, a mix of trained patience and mild amusement, as he listened to Brenda's long-winded accusation. She spoke in escalating volume about community standards, unapproved structures, refusal to comply, and something about setting a dangerous precedent. I could hear her just fine from where I was standing, and so could half the block. After her opening monologue, Delgado raised one brow and said, "And this is a criminal matter, how?" Brenda blinked. "He won't let me inspect his property. I have the authority under the HOA charter to verify compliance." Delgado held up a hand. "Okay, stop right there. Let's be clear. You're not law enforcement, and a homeowner is not obligated to let you onto private property without consent. If there's a legal dispute, that's civil court, not 911. The moment he said that, Brenda's face flushed, a blend of embarrassment and fury. "But I'm trying to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood," she insisted, clutching her clipboard like it was a badge. Delgado tilted his head slightly. "And I'm trying to respond to actual emergencies. You called this in like it was a public safety issue." She sputtered. "It is. He's violating—" He cut her off with a polite but firm tone. "Ma'am, unless someone's being threatened or breaking the law, this doesn't involve us. I suggest you take your HOA concerns back to the board and follow the appropriate channels." At this point, I walked up to the gate, paperwork in hand, the signed approval from the architectural committee, photographs of the shed construction, and even a copy of the HOA charter with the relevant section highlighted. "I'm more than happy to cooperate with reasonable processes," I said, "but barging onto my property without notice, then calling the cops when I say no? That's not how this works." Delgado skimmed the documents, nodded, and then did something I didn't expect. He laughed. It started as a short chuckle, then a full, honest laugh that he tried to stifle. "Man," he said, flipping through the pages, "you're more organized than most of the reports I get from Dispatch." Brenda stood frozen, her mouth open in disbelief. Delgado turned to her and added, "Honestly, this is a waste of department time. If I filed a report every time someone had a disagreement with their HOA, I'd never get real police work done." He tipped his head to me. "You're good. Just keep your documentation up. She tries anything else, you've got a solid case." Then, turning to Brenda, he gave a final piece of advice. "Don't call emergency services unless there's an emergency. Next time, we might issue a fine, or worse." Brenda was stunned. She tried to say something else, but Delgado was already back in his cruiser. He gave me a slight salute before pulling away. As his taillights disappeared, the silence that followed was almost comical. I could hear a lawnmower 3 houses down, and birds chirping like nothing had happened. Brenda stood in the street, gripping her clipboard so tightly, I thought the thing might snap in half. She gave me one final glare, pure venom, and walked stiffly back to her car. I turned and headed inside, smiling to myself. I didn't slam the door or gloat. I didn't need to. The entire neighborhood had just watched her summon the police, only to be publicly corrected and laughed at, all because she couldn't handle being told no. It was a moment of small but meaningful victory, not just for me, but for every neighbor who'd ever had a passive-aggressive note slipped under their door or a photo of their garbage cans emailed to the board. From that day on, Brenda stopped making surprise visits. Not because she changed, but because now she knew I wouldn't back down. And if she pushed too far, there'd be more than just me pushing back. After Officer Delgado pulled away that afternoon, a strange kind of calm settled over my front yard. Brenda had retreated to wherever HOA presidents go to lick their wounds, and I stood there in a quiet moment of satisfaction. Not because I embarrassed her. Okay, maybe just a little, but because, for the first time, someone in an official capacity had looked the situation straight in the eye and called it what it was. Absurd. About an hour later, as I was moving some tools back into the shed, yes, the infamous shed, I heard a car pull up again. It was Officer Delgado, back without the lights, casually stepping out of his cruiser. No clipboard, no tension. Just curiosity and, as he put it, a few thoughts. "You mind if I ask you something off the record?" he said, approaching the gate with his hands in his vest pockets. "Sure," I said, brushing dirt off my hands. "Has she done this kind of thing before?" I half laughed. "You have no idea. She's been trying to enforce HOA rules like she's running a federal agency. This whole shed issue, already approved by the committee weeks ago." Delgado nodded slowly. "You'd be surprised how often we get these kinds of calls. HOA presidents, self-appointed neighborhood watch types. You'd think people would save the police line for, I don't know, actual crimes." He leaned on the fence and added, "The worst part? Some officers will take their word for it, especially if they walk in with confidence and a clipboard. I've seen homeowners harassed because they didn't know their rights." That last part hit me. I'd done the reading. I knew what the HOA could and couldn't do. I'd filed the paperwork. I had my bases covered. But what about the elderly couple 2 doors down? Or the single mom across the street who worked 60 hours a week and didn't have time to review page 34 of the HOA charter? Delgado went on. "Most HOAs are fine. They keep things clean, organized. But sometimes you get people like her, people who think a title gives them power to control others. It doesn't. Not when it comes to private property, and not when someone like you pushes back." We chatted for a few more minutes, not as homeowner and cop, but as two people shaking their heads at the oddity of suburban politics. He told me about another incident where a different HOA president had once called 911 because a resident hung wind chimes that were audible from the street. The responding officer laughed so hard he had to walk around the block to keep a straight face. I asked him why he even came back. "Because I could tell she's not done," he said plainly. "People like that don't stop when they lose. They escalate. Just watch your back, document everything, and don't engage when you don't have to." It was advice that felt both sobering and strangely comforting. Before he left, he said something that stuck with me. "You know what wins these things in the long run? Calm people with receipts. Let her rant. Let her look like the unstable one. You just keep stacking facts." I nodded. "I can do calm, and I've got plenty of receipts." Delgado grinned and tapped the top of the gate. "Then you'll be fine. And if she does call again, I'll make sure dispatch remembers this one." With that, he got back in his cruiser and rolled off, leaving behind more than just tire marks. He'd given me perspective and a plan. The thing about power-hungry people is they rely on your silence. They expect you to bow out, to cave under pressure, to avoid conflict at any cost. But when you stand there, calmly, without fear, holding up the rules they claim to enforce, that's when the real power shifts. And Brenda, she'd just been reminded that no matter how many clipboards she carried, she wasn't the sheriff of this neighborhood. The rest of that week passed without incident. No letters, no surprise visits, no sideways glances from neighbors. Word had gotten around. Apparently, Brenda had become the latest cautionary tale. But if Delgado was right, and I had a strong feeling he was, then this wasn't the end. It was just the first round, and I was ready. In most suburban conflicts, the scariest part isn't the HOA fines, the policy letters, or even the threat of legal action. It's the quiet judgment from your own neighbors, the glances across driveways, the way conversations cut short when you approach, the feeling that people are watching, not out of curiosity, but out of alignment. I expected some of that after the police were called to my house over a shed and a gate. Brenda had a reputation for being difficult, but she was also persuasive, especially with the more passive members of the HOA. For years, she'd built a network of rule-abiding allies who preferred things quiet and orderly, even if it meant sacrificing a little freedom. So I braced myself for a cold shoulder. But what I got instead surprised me. The day after Officer Delgado's second visit, as I was watering the roses out front, Mr. Levinson from 3 doors down strolled by with his usual cane and baseball cap. "You made the neighborhood watch list," he said with a grin. I laughed. "That doesn't surprise me." "She called my wife yesterday," he continued. "Tried to get her to speak at the next HOA meeting against you. Told her you were creating tension." "What did she say?" "She hung up," he said, chuckling. "Told Brenda to stop calling unless her house was on fire." That wasn't the only surprise. Later that afternoon, Tanya, a single mom from 2 blocks over, knocked on my door. She'd always waved politely, but we'd never had much of a conversation beyond that. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, holding a tray of cookies. "You're the first person I've seen stand up to Brenda in public. She tried to fine me last year because my kid left a skateboard on the porch." I invited her in, and we talked for nearly an hour. Apparently, there were more stories. A retired couple fined for planting sunflowers instead of HOA-approved tulips. A man nearly taken to small claims court over a wind spinner. An entire section of the community that felt like they were constantly one complaint away from a confrontation. Brenda had ruled not with fairness, but with fatigue. Most people just gave in because they didn't have the time or energy to fight. But now, thanks to her overreach with me and the public failure that followed, people were waking up. Over the next week, I started noticing little things. people slowing down when they passed, giving a thumbs up or a knowing smile, neighbors asking about their own HOA rights, even a few folks requesting copies of the bylaws and charter, inspired to finally read them after years of blindly following the rules. It wasn't a revolution, but it was something. Of course, not everyone was on my side. Karen, Brenda's unofficial second-in-command, glared at me from her driveway whenever our paths crossed. She hosted her regular garden club meetings, which I was fairly certain had turned into strategy sessions for reinstating HOA supremacy. I caught them glancing toward my property more than once, clipboards in hand, as if hoping to spot some new infraction they could pounce on. There were whispers that Brenda was trying to call an emergency meeting of the board. Some said she wanted to introduce new language into the bylaws, language that would allow random inspections of suspicious properties. Others claimed she was gathering signatures to censure me or revoke some privileges as a homeowner. I wasn't worried. With the way she'd embarrassed herself in front of law enforcement, and with more neighbors now aware of how she operated, her influence was thinning. Still, I kept to my plan. Stay calm. Stay documented. Speak only when necessary. I wasn't looking to rally a mob or run for the board. I just wanted peace, real peace, not the brittle quiet that comes from being afraid to make waves. The truth is, conflict doesn't divide communities. Silence does. The kind of silence that allows bullies to flourish in plain sight. Once people started talking, comparing stories, and realizing they weren't alone, something shifted. One evening, a few neighbors gathered in my driveway with lawn chairs and drinks, something we hadn't done in years. We laughed, we shared Brenda stories, and we made vague plans for attending the next HOA meeting. Together. That night, as the porch lights flickered on up and down the street, I realized that I hadn't just stood my ground against Brenda. I'd given people permission to stand with me. And that's how communities change. If there's one thing Brenda Halbrook had mastered over the years, it was the art of maintaining a thin veneer of control. In her pastel pantsuits and well-coiffed hair, she had long projected an image of polished authority, the type that made people hesitate before questioning her. But when control starts slipping from the hands of someone like Brenda, it doesn't go quietly. It crashes. And crash it did, spectacularly, at the next HOA meeting. It was the first time I had decided to attend one, not out of interest in HOA policy, but because half the neighborhood insisted I go. After the backyard inspection debacle and the police incident, a lot of people were curious to see what Brenda would do next. So, on a Thursday evening, folding chair under one arm and a printed copy of the HOA charter under the other, I walked into the Ridgewood Hills Community Center. The turnout was different. Usually, these meetings only pulled in the same 6 retirees and one guy who always asked about pickleball courts. This time, nearly 40 residents showed up, many of them faces I'd never seen at a meeting. They were curious, alert, and most importantly, not there to be lectured. Brenda stood at the front like a pastor at the pulpit, flanked by Karen and the rest of the board. You could tell from her tight smile that she wasn't pleased about the turnout. "Let's begin," she said into the microphone, eyes scanning the crowd. "We have a full agenda tonight. Violations, landscaping approvals, budget updates." But no one was paying attention to her list. They were all waiting for what she was going to say about the incident. And she knew it. About 20 minutes in, Brenda got to the item she had been waiting for, a new proposed amendment to the HOA bylaws. The room quieted. "We are proposing," she said, voice stiff, "a revision that will allow the HOA board to inspect properties suspected of violations without prior notice in order to protect neighborhood standards." The moment she said the words, "without prior notice," the room shifted. People leaned in. Some gasped. A couple whispered to each other. One man in the back just said, "You've got to be kidding me." That was my cue. I raised my hand, calm as ever. Brenda's eyes locked on me. Yes, Mr. Carter. Just to clarify, I said, holding up my printed bylaws, this amendment would give board members physical access to residents' private property without written request or homeowner approval. Brenda stiffened. In cases where compliance is in question, yes. The HOA has a duty. To spy on people? I asked plainly. To bypass due process. She opened her mouth, then shut it. The room was silent. Another neighbor, Tanya, spoke up next. So what if I leave my recycling bin out too long? Can you just walk into my backyard? Brenda snapped. If you're not doing anything wrong, what are you afraid of? The room collectively inhaled. There it was, the crack in the facade. Someone in the second row said, "That's not how the law works." Brenda's face turned red. We can't maintain a respectable community if people are allowed to flaunt the rules. She pointed at me, built an unauthorized structure. I held up the signed approval. This is from the Architectural Committee. You've seen it. She slammed a stack of papers on the table. That doesn't matter. I wasn't consulted. Another voice chimed in. Brenda, this isn't a monarchy. That did it. She stood up, banging her hand on the podium. If you all want to live in chaos, fine. But don't come crying when your property values drop and this community turns into a dump. Gasps, murmurs. Even Karen looked uneasy now. For a long moment, Brenda just stood there, breathing heavily, scanning the crowd for support. But no one said a word. A few people looked away. Others crossed their arms. It was over. A board member, Joe, who'd previously said nothing more controversial than, "We should repaint the pool chairs," quietly leaned into the microphone and said, "I motion we table this amendment indefinitely." The crowd erupted in soft applause. Brenda didn't say another word. She packed her things and stormed out, clipboard under her arm like a defeated general retreating from battle. The meeting went on, but the mood had shifted. For the first time in years, people were laughing, asking real questions, and suggesting ways to actually improve the neighborhood, not control it. It felt like the HOA was finally returning to its purpose, serving the residents, not policing them. As I left the community center, several people clapped me on the shoulder or simply said, "Thanks." Not for being loud or confrontational, but for being the quiet catalyst that finally made people speak up. Brenda may have had her meltdown, but the community, it found its voice. And it wasn't going silent again. After the meltdown at the HOA meeting, I realized something. Winning a public argument with Brenda was only half the battle. The other half was making sure she couldn't try again. I knew her type. The defeat would fester like an old wound, and eventually she'd try a new angle. Maybe sneakier, maybe legal, but definitely not done. So I decided to prepare for round two, quietly, thoroughly, and legally. That's when the idea of locking things down became literal. First, I installed a privacy gate. Nothing over the top, just a solid, well-built wooden gate with a coded lock, enough to send a message. This is my boundary, and you don't cross it without my permission. I chose materials that matched the rest of my property to keep it aesthetic and code compliant. I wasn't about to give Brenda new ammo. The gate was tall enough to provide real privacy and sturdy enough that no one could accidentally push it open. Then came the security cameras, 4 of them, to be precise. I mounted one at the front gate, one above the garage, and 2 in the backyard, angled just enough to cover vulnerable areas without invading anyone else's space. Every camera was clearly visible, with signs that said, "Recording in progress, for your safety and mine." But this wasn't about paranoia. It was about proof. I didn't want confrontations. I wanted documentation. If Brenda, or anyone else, stepped onto my property again without cause, I'd have time-stamped high-definition footage. If she claimed something false, I'd have evidence. And most importantly, I could protect myself from the kind of HOA shenanigans that usually happen when no one's watching. As I was finishing up the final install, my neighbor Doug wandered over. "Camera guy now, huh?" he said with a smile. "Just being careful," I replied. "Turns out my property makes a lot of people nervous." Doug laughed. "Brenda's been real quiet since the meeting." "Too quiet," I muttered. "That's what worries me." He looked around at the gate, the fresh gravel along the path, the trimmed hedges. "You know, it's funny. You're the one accused of causing problems, but your place is one of the best kept on the block." "Presentation matters," I said, tightening the last screw on the bracket, "especially when dealing with people who love pretending they're in charge." Later that week, I made one more addition, a legal disclaimer plaque on the gate. "Private property, no trespassing without owner consent. Violators may be prosecuted under local and state law." It wasn't just for show. I'd consulted a local real estate attorney and made sure everything I did was airtight. Cameras were placed within legal limits. The gate didn't obstruct community easements. My signage was compliant, and most importantly, I now had written documentation of my property boundaries and rights, filed with the county and the HOA board. I emailed Brenda a formal notice, too, short, polite, and legally precise. "Dear HOA President Halbrook, following recent events, I have updated the perimeter security on my property to prevent unauthorized access. Please note that any future inspection requests must be submitted in writing in accordance with Section 3.2 of the HOA Charter. Unauthorized entry will be considered trespassing under state law. Respectfully, Michael Carter." No anger, no sarcasm, just facts. I never got a reply. Instead, a few days later, I saw her drive slowly past my house in her powder blue sedan. She didn't stop, she didn't wave, just looked up at the gate, the camera, the sign, and kept driving. And that was fine with me. This wasn't about intimidation. It wasn't even about winning. It was about reclaiming my peace and making it clear. I know the rules, and I'm not afraid to stand behind them. That's something people like Brenda can't handle, not because it's hostile, but because it's unshakable. In the weeks that followed, other neighbors began taking similar steps. A few added simple gates. One couple installed a ring camera. Another resident asked if I'd share my legal sources for filing a boundary update. The silent majority was starting to understand that boundaries weren't just physical, they were psychological. And sometimes the most respectful way to coexist with a control freak is to draw a line so clear, no one dares cross it again. The HOA didn't fall apart. The world didn't end. The lawns stayed trimmed, the mailboxes upright, and the trash bins neat. But one thing changed. People weren't afraid anymore. And as for me, I didn't just build a gate. I built peace of mind. It had been nearly a month of silence. No clipboard knocks, no passive-aggressive emails, no sudden HOA summons. Brenda had gone unusually quiet, and while most people saw it as a welcome relief, I knew better. She wasn't done. She was regrouping. And sure enough, just when things started to feel settled, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. Hand-delivered, not mailed. No stamp, no postmark, just the unmistakable cursive of Brenda Halbrook on the return label. Inside was a formal Notice of HOA Board Review. According to the letter, I was being summoned to a mandatory compliance hearing regarding multiple violations of Ridgewood Hills Association guidelines, which allegedly included unauthorized construction, again with the shed, installation of unsanctioned surveillance equipment, erecting a barrier without express board approval, conduct unbecoming of a resident as defined by Section 9.1 of the Code of Conduct. That last one made me laugh out loud. I didn't even know we had a code of conduct, let alone one vague enough to prosecute for attitude. The hearing was scheduled for the following week at the community center. Attendance, the letter said, was non-negotiable and enforceable by HOA statute. Cute. I made 2 phone calls, one to my attorney and one to Officer Delgado, not because I expected any criminal issues, but because I wanted a witness who had already seen this circus once before. The night of the hearing, I walked in dressed, clean, calm, and with a folder full of paperwork. Brenda, as expected, was already there, flanked by Karen and 2 other board members who rarely spoke in meetings but always nodded vigorously when Brenda did. "Mr. Carter," Brenda said as I took a seat, "thank you for attending this important matter." I smiled. "Always a pleasure." She wasted no time. She began reading from a prepared script, outlining the supposed violations, complete with selectively quoted sections from the HOA charter. "Your gate was installed without explicit visual review from the board," she read, "and your security equipment is making several residents uncomfortable." Karen nodded like it was gospel. I waited for her to finish and then calmly slid my stack of documents across the table. These include the original email correspondence with the Architectural Committee, which approved the shed. The gate, not subject to external review since it doesn't alter community-facing elevation. Cameras, installed within legal bounds, not pointed at any neighboring home, and compliant with state privacy law. And finally, I flipped to the last page, a signed legal statement from my counsel confirming the same. Brenda flipped through the papers in frustration, lips tightening by the second. Karen leaned over and whispered something that made her even redder in the face. One of the board members, Greg, a quiet man with glasses and a faint air of common sense, picked up the packet and started reading. After a few minutes, he raised a hand. "I'm sorry, but everything here looks compliant. In fact, I didn't even know half of these forms existed. Why wasn't this shared with the board before now?" Brenda snapped. "Because he didn't follow procedure." I gently corrected her. "I followed the written procedure, just not yours." Greg nodded slowly. "Right, the documented one." The room was silent. Then Officer Delgado, who had shown up and quietly sat in the back, stood and said, "For what it's worth, I've already confirmed that Mr. Carter hasn't broken any municipal laws, and I've advised him to document everything, which he clearly has." Brenda looked like she wanted to scream. Her lips trembled, her nostrils flared. She stood abruptly, gathering her things. "This board," she announced dramatically, "has been undermined by misinformation and personal agendas." "Brenda," Greg said, trying not to roll his eyes, "the only agenda here is the one you printed, and it doesn't hold water." She stormed out, leaving her gavel on the table like a discarded badge. That night, word spread fast. Within 24 hours, a petition started circulating, not to remove Brenda, yet, but to limit the board president's authority and require board-wide approval for any disciplinary actions. It gained 40 signatures by morning. Brenda had made her final move, the dramatic, overreaching swing of someone desperate to regain control. But instead of reclaiming power, she had handed the neighborhood even more reason to push for reform. The letter had backfired. Badly. And for the first time in a long time, Ridgewood Hills felt like it belonged to the residents again. 2 weeks after Brenda's dramatic exit from the HOA disciplinary meeting, things had finally begun to settle in Ridgewood Hills. The air felt lighter, like the whole neighborhood had exhaled. For the first time in years, people were talking not just about rules and violations, but about community events, block parties, and maybe even forming a gardening club that wasn't used as a tool for surveillance. Still, there was a lingering unease. Not fear, exactly, but anticipation. We all knew someone like Brenda doesn't just vanish after losing control. She'd gone quiet, which was far more unsettling than if she'd stayed loud. So when a familiar white and blue cruiser pulled up in front of my house one afternoon, I wasn't surprised. Officer Delgado stepped out, holding a clipboard in one hand and a grin in the other. "Figured I'd make one more visit before this saga ends," he said, walking up the path. "Let me guess, Brenda again?" I asked, half joking as I poured him a glass of iced tea. "Technically, yes," he said, "but not in the way you think." He handed me the clipboard. It was a printed copy of a formal cease and desist letter filed against Brenda by the HOA's own legal counsel. A copy, he said, was accidentally shared with his department after Brenda tried filing a harassment claim against me. "She tried to spin the situation to make it look like you were stalking her," he said, chuckling as he leaned against the porch rail. "Claimed you weaponized the neighborhood against her." "And how far did she get with that?" I asked. "About as far as her last emergency HOA meeting. Nowhere," he replied. "The lawyer saw right through it. Apparently you weren't the only resident keeping records. 4 other people submitted documentation of her inappropriate behavior." I whistled. "Didn't think she'd go that far." "Oh, she went further. Tried to say the cameras you installed were pointed into her bedroom window, even though you live a full street away." We both laughed, loudly. But the humor didn't take away from the seriousness of what he was saying. Brenda had gone from overbearing to obsessive, and now even the board had seen enough. According to Delgado, the board had voted, quietly but unanimously, to strip Brenda of her title as HOA president, citing abuse of authority, community division, and repeated legal overreach. Karen stepped down the following morning. There was no fanfare, no official announcement, just a printed bulletin on the community board in front of the clubhouse. The HOA board welcomes interim leadership changes and looks forward to rebuilding trust with the residents of Ridgewood Hills. Delgado looked out at the street, peaceful and bright in the late afternoon sun. "You know," he said, "I respond to a lot of nonsense in this job, but every now and then you get to see someone stand up the right way, with patience, not anger. That's rare." I shrugged. "I just didn't want her walking into my yard." He raised his glass in a mock toast. "Well, you built more than a fence. You helped the whole block finally grow a spine." We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Kids rode by on bikes. Someone was mowing a lawn down the street. The sound of a sprinkler hissed in the distance. For once, Ridgewood Hills felt like the neighborhood it was always pretending to be. Delgado stood to leave. Before he stepped off the porch, he turned back. "Just so you know," he said, "we've had fewer calls from your HOA in the past 2 weeks than we had all of last year." "That's what happens when the clipboard loses its crown," I said. He laughed, tipped his head, and walked back to his cruiser. That evening, a few neighbors stopped by to share the news. Some brought cookies, others brought lawn chairs. Someone even brought a tiny Bluetooth speaker and played Sinatra, while we all sat on my porch swapping stories about the HOA's dark ages. And for the first time, no one was afraid of getting written up for gathering without a permit. Looking back on it now, it's wild how something as simple as a shed, a gate, and a camera triggered such a transformation. I didn't mean to start a movement. I just wanted to be left alone. But in doing so, I guess I reminded people that they didn't have to accept absurd rules and silent tyranny in the name of neighborhood standards. The moral of the story: know your rights, stand your ground, and when all else fails, build a gate, set up a camera, and drink your tea while they watch their power unravel from the outside.